Hello friends, my name is Bintou and welcome back to my channel. So we find ourselves in the month of October. I'm seeing all of the YouTube and booktube videos on fall reading recommendations, and of course it's Halloween month, so we've got the horror and thriller books. I don't think that I could spend an entire month just reading horror and a thriller. I actually do love thrillers in general, but I have a hard time spending an entire month just reading one genre. So instead, what I want to do is talk about the top 5 horror/thriller books that I've read so far in the year 2020. I haven't read enough of pure horror to have like a whole top 5, so that's why I'm mixing the two. Though for me personally, I find horror and thriller to be pretty separate. Like I count the horror books as like those haunted house books, and then the thriller books, I tend to read a lot of like crime thrillers, which isn't really the Halloween spirit. So I'm gonna try to steer away from those on this list. So number 5 on the list, I'm gonna go with Beloved by Toni Morrison. Now, if you are anything like me, you probably would not have even imagined that this book would belong on this list. But this is a haunted house book, or at the very least, it starts off as a haunted house book, and there are supernatural elements in here. So we have the main character, Setha. She lives in a house that is haunted by a ghost who happens to be the ghost of her firstborn child who died. So she's haunting the house. And eventually there's a spirit that's gonna come back in person that they have to figure out what to do with. This is a really fascinating story, not just for that horror element, but also because of the questions that it grapples with like really hard decisions that she has to make because of the effects of slavery on their psyche and their family. So Beloved would be number 5 on that list. I believe that I gave this it was like a 3.5 star read because it's on the longer side. Not that the book is extremely long, it's about 300 some odd pages, but the story is a little bit slow in the middle, and it can be really confusing in the very beginning, probably because again, I didn't know that it was a haunted house book. So that's why I was just utterly confused when I first picked this up. But overall, well worth the read, and I had made it a goal to read more Toni Morrison this year, so that's why I had read this, and I would recommend it if you were considering it. All right, the 4th book on my list is Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. Now, I am one of those people, it seems like people either really love Riley Sager's books or are not that impressed. I think I fall more into the not that impressed category because I thought his books were okay. I read 2 of them, so I read Lock Every Door and Home Before Dark. I preferred Lock Every Door. So Lock Every Door follows the main character. Her name is Jules, and she is like in between jobs and she needs a place to live. So she found this awesome deal babysitting or not babysitting, room sitting this apartment in this famous Manhattan building. And it's a great deal, almost too good to be true because, spoiler alert, it is too good to be true. So she moves into the building. She's meeting or getting to know the residents that live there, and she suspects that the person that lived in the apartment before her disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and she's trying to get answers, but of course she's running into obstacles from the people that live there. Other house sitters, because she's not the only one, also begin to disappear, and yeah, so she's trying to figure out what's going on. I actually think that the ending of this book caught me by surprise enough that that's why I respected it, because I didn't predict what was coming at the end. It's not the most original because I feel like the story has been told. I don't know if I have personally read it, but it's definitely a story that I feel like has been told, but I enjoyed that one. So that book actually kept me reading. So if you're looking for a Riley Sager with a haunted building twist, I would recommend that one. There is an element in that book that shows up in the next book that I'm going to talk about, the Ouroboros. I actually really didn't know anything about the Ouroboros. I looked it up after Riley Sager's book because it played such a prominent role in that book. And it also plays a huge role in my next choice, which is Mexican Gothic. So number 3 on my list is Mexican Gothic. And I actually very recently read this book. I read it like last week. And it took me a while to get to this because it was released, I think, several months ago. But the reason it took me so long is because there was such a long wait at my library for this book, and I finally got it. in October, so I got really lucky. And I mostly listened to the audiobook for this book, like 90% of the book I listened to. And that's really important to note because one of the biggest complaints about this story is that there's like nothing happening for a long time, so it feels like it's really drawn out. Because I spent the entire weekend, like I was like decluttering and meal prepping and cleaning. So I spent the entire weekend just like catching up on a whole bunch of chores and stuff. So I wasn't doing anything. So the fact that the story was moving slowly as I was listening to it was almost a benefit. And another thing, because I listened to the audiobook, there aren't so many characters that it got lost. So I really enjoyed the audiobook for this book. I think that if I were sitting down to read it like I normally read books, I would probably feel the same way that a lot of people did. However, this book took me by surprise. It was pretty good. And again, I'm not like a huge haunted house reader, but I think this one was so well done. It's set in Mexico, and so we have this young girl, and her name is Noemi. She goes to see her cousin because her family got a strange letter from her cousin who was recently married, and they suspect that her husband is up to no good. So her father sends her off to her cousin's marriage house with the task of trying to figure out, well, what is going on in this house. Thus begins the haunted house story. So she's getting there, she's having strange dreams. The people that live in the house have all of these super weird rules. So like they can't talk at dinner, and she just feels like there's something going on there. With the people in the house, and they're not being completely forthcoming about what is going on. Her cousin is suffering, so she's trying to get her cousin to leave the house, but they won't let her, so they're trying to block her way. So we're following her journey and her stay there. She befriends one of the young boys in the house, and eventually she becomes trapped in the house. I don't want to give away too much because I feel like the ending is where this book really shines, when all of the reveals happen. And there were some pretty gory details in there. It wasn't frightening, and that's probably because it was so slow to build up, but Mexican Gothic was pretty enjoyable. I would recommend this one if you're considering it. And I think it's a perfect October read. I'm really glad that I got to this one. All right, two more. I'm gonna go with The Night Swim. The Night Swim was a thriller. So this isn't like a horror book. It is pretty much straight up thriller. And at that, it is more of a crime thriller than anything else. But I really enjoy The Night Swim, so that's why I'm including it on here. So The Night Swim, it follows this girl. She runs this like murder mystery podcast, and so she travels to this new town to follow a rape trial. And there are two main storylines. So she's following the rape trial, and there is someone that lives in the town that contacted her because her sister passed away mysteriously, and she wants the main character to dig up what really happened, try to find out the truth about what happened. Those two storylines do eventually converge, as probably you would expect when you're in the middle of reading them. But my favorite part about this book was just the podcast element. For this book, I listened to the audiobook as well as reading it, and the audiobook really treats it like a podcast when it gets to the podcast episodes. So I think that was spectacularly done in this book. Highly recommend listening to the audiobook for this one. As far as the story goes, I think that it was pretty engrossing. So I read this one nearly straight through. So I had a hard time putting it down. And I gotta say, I really like Megan Goldin's book. So I had read The Escape Room, probably the previous month to this one. And that's why I ended up picking up Night Swim. And I loved them both. So Megan Goldin has become a new favorite author of mine. And if she puts out any other books, I'm definitely going to pick them up. And all of that brings us to my number one choice, and that is The Shining by Stephen King. So I read The Shining for the first time this year, and that book is legit scary. I read it at night, big mistake, before going to sleep, because I don't know why. This doesn't happen to me very easily, but Stephen King's writing in that book just really, really scared me. The Shining involves the Torrance family. So Jack Torrance moves into the Overlook Hotel with his wife and their young son. And he's gonna be the caretaker. So he has to look after the hotel, mainly to make sure that the boiler in the basement doesn't overheat and explode. So it's winter time, everyone's leaving. Eventually they're gonna be snowed in with no way to get in or out of the Overlook Hotel. And that's when the weird things start happening. So Jack Torrance is an alcoholic, but he had been sober. But the hotel like comes alive with a lot of the people that have died in it over the course of its existence, and they're basically terrorizing this entire family. I feel like I can't say this because I don't read enough horror, but I also feel like I need to say that The Shining is truly a horror masterpiece. I loved this so much, and my favorite character by far, Halloran. He is a chef in the hotel, and he also has this thing called The Shining, where he basically has really strong intuition, and Jack's son also has The Shining, except his shine is what he calls it, is super, super strong. Halloran eventually plays a pretty strong role towards the end of the book that I won't get into because spoilers. But I gotta say, Shining probably is high on my list just in general of books that I read this year. And I understand why people consider it one of his best work. I did read the sequel to it, Dr. Sleep, and I know most people hate on it, and it is really not as good as The Shining was, but I'm glad I read it anyway. I enjoyed seeing what happened to Jack's son and seeing how he turned out. It didn't turn out well for him. I was hoping for a happier ending, but I should have known better. It's Stephen King. So that is that. So those are the top 5. I've got some honorary mentions that I feel like couldn't necessarily go on the list because they weren't true horror, but they are some of my favorite thriller books that I read this year. Find Me was one of them, and this was one of the Amazon Prime first reads, and I really enjoyed this book. Follows a serial killer and trying to like uncover all of the bodies that he killed and figure out who was really responsible for it. So that one is more thriller. And I also really enjoyed The Institute by Stephen King. I guess that one would be, I don't know if it's horror, but it was very suspenseful. And I really enjoyed that book. I read most of it in one night because I had to finish the kid's journey in that book. So I really like that one. Riley Sager's Home Before Dark. Again, not my favorite of his. I definitely preferred Lock Every Door. But it is a true haunted house book. His endings though, I don't like his endings. So I think that's why I didn't love this one. And if you're gonna go for a haunted house book, I preferred Mexican Gothic 100%. And The Stand. Again, I guess this one is horror. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty scary. The Stand was pretty scary. Definitely a very scary book to read in the midst of a pandemic. So those are my recommendations for horror/thriller during this crazy month. Let me know if you enjoy reading horror or thriller books, and which ones you've read so far this year. Definitely interested to check that out in the comment section. In the meantime, as always, thank you again for watching my videos, and I will see you in the next one.